Now, I'd like to request one of our members who is himself a medical professional, not just an ordinary professional, to you, Dr. Guleria, because Dr. Radhakrishnan knows him well. He is Dr. Krishna Hande, and his father, Dr. H.V. Hande, was a minister under the health minister of the state under the late Dr. MGR's government, and in association with the Rotary Club of Madras, brought in the red measles vaccine first to the state of Tamil Nadu and then the polio. And from our club started the first efforts of Polio Plus. So, in a way, this 93-year-old club, the Rotary Club of Madras, was responsible for bringing in this whole idea of vaccination for polio. Today, we have associated with the government of Tamil Nadu all over again through the kind offices of Dr. Radhakrishnan and the present dispensation. And we hope that we are as successful in getting rid of this deadly virus as we were with polio. Dr. Krishna Hande, over to you. And they're both available. So let's go on for some time.
Thank you, Mohan. Sir, thank you very much for that. Was a wonderful talk. I hope all of you can hear me.
Yes.
So, and congratulations on acquiring a kitty of vaccines. Today, I saw that a lot of vaccines without the bridging test can be had, and that's fantastic. I have collated and asked a few questions, clubbed a few questions together. The first question probably goes to both of you. We are closing, we are opening malls and cinema theaters, but closing open air beaches. We're still having campaigning going on throughout the country. And we have a lot of religious functions and melas going on. So how do you balance the science with with the humane sort of control over the crowds?
Shall I take it first, sir? Or
yes, please.
Dr. Hande, I think you have hit the nail on it. But you would recall that when nobody else was crying hoarse, I was repeatedly telling in the month of March that the political gatherings without social distancing, despite in the permission the organizers undertaking the mask was flouted, and we had a number of car festivals. The point you have told is that what we have we have put in a lot of controls after the April 6th. If you look at we closed the schools, colleges, and all the non-essential activities, and malls and thing. What we have done is restricted the. What we find is that the maximum entrance is only in the restaurants and the theaters. So that we have restricted the entries to less than 50%. As far as the beaches are concerned, it is more a symbolic thing. Health department was of the view that open air could be touched upon last. But generally what happens is that, that creates a sense of where people come back and say, sir, so much of crowding is there in the beach and nothing is being done. So what Tamil Nadu government is aiming is at more effective micro containment, which is what Government of India and even in the Prime Minister's address, they have said quite a lot of things like night curfew and all are more to create corona curfew. These kind of things will create a sense that everything is not complete. No, the feeling is everything is fine. So I am sure, as Government of Tamil Nadu has mentioned, after putting in a number of restrictions, the beach restrictions are only in the weekend. But if the number continues to keep rising in a bigger way, I am sure the other restrictions will come. It is not that the other restrictions are not being thought of.
Sir, for Dr. Guleria, question. Kudos to the authorities for having conducted the elections in a fantastic manner. Now, you were saying that the variants seem to be chasing the vaccine and the effectiveness of the vaccine may come down as time goes by. So is there any method, or how good is India in sequencing the variations as they emerge?
So India has set up a whole network of 10 labs which do gene sequencing, and they have a target of doing at least 5% of the samples which are positive in the country sequencing. Along with that, there is also the plan that wherever there is a cluster or increasing number of cases, samples will be taken from there for gene sequences to look for emerging variants. There are also at least 2 or 3 institutes which are doing lab studies to look at seeing whether the variants are developing an immune escape mechanism which will make the vaccine become less effective. But I personally feel that as we move forward, we need to ramp this up more and more, because surveillance is very, very important. And we have to combine surveillance with the epidemiological and clinical data. If you pick up a variant, then you have to combine that with what is this variant doing? Is it more infectious? Is it causing more death? Is it causing reinfection, or is it leading to less efficacy of the vaccine? So that type of networking of combining your sequence data along with the epidemiological and clinical data needs to be done. That is already being done to some extent, but there is a big move to really ramp it up, because as we move forward, this will become very, very important in terms of the assessing the variants that are emerging and the efficacy of the vaccine and the chance of reinfection, if I put it that way.
Thank you, sir. Now, you told us about logistics and about the limitations of availability, the production catching up with the usage. You have said 45 and above can be vaccinated now. Is it a fact that younger and people are getting more affected by this wave than the previous wave? And a sequel to that question is, now we found that one of the Rotarian's son is representing India in the Olympics. Could we have a plan to identify such people and vaccinate them when they go abroad to represent the country?
So first of all, let me really congratulate Varun and his family for representing India in the Olympics. This is truly a great achievement. Already there is a plan by the government of India that all athletes and the group which will be going for the Olympics will get vaccinated, and that is part of the vaccination plan. So I'm sure he would be included in the vaccination as part of the team which is going. But I think it's important to understand 2 things. One is what is the aim of vaccination, and thereby why are we sort of doing it in a graded manner. The aim of vaccination predominantly is 2. One is to decrease mortality. We don't want that we should have higher number of people dying because of COVID. And therefore, because of that, high risk group, those who are the elderly, those who have comorbid conditions and could have very severe COVID, become the top priority for vaccination. Second group is those who are on managing or on the front line as far as COVID, the fight against COVID is concerned, because we don't want a large number of healthcare workers or frontline workers to become sick and cause a strain on the system, because if they are not available to manage patients, it'll be a huge problem. Because of that, the first vaccination priority was the elderly, those with comorbidities, healthcare workers, and frontline workers. As we move along, we will actually vaccinate more and more people. And I'm confident now, with vaccines coming from outside also and production being ramped up, and now Sputnik vaccine also coming up, that we will be able to vaccinate more and more people and bring it down to the younger age group. It's true that if you look at the data now, then more younger people are getting the infection as compared to the older people. And I think that is also partly related to the fact that the degree of travel and, let's say, COVID inappropriate behavior is more in that generation. Many of them feel that, I would say they are less fearful, if I put it that way, that they will not get the infection or they'll get a mild infection, so they need not worry. So outside you'll find a lot of younger generation people mixing around, having parties or going out together for the weekend. That is actually causing the spread of the disease. And I would just like to say 2 things. One is that they may get a mild infection, but they will carry it to their residence, their homes, where their parents or grandparents are there, and they may get a more severe infection. And the second thing that I'd like to say is it's important to understand that COVID is not just a simple infection. We have a large number of people who have what we call long COVID or a post-COVID sequelae. You may have a mild COVID, but even when after you recover, for weeks or months, you have chronic fatigue syndrome. You're not able to concentrate. You have what people call brain fog. There is at times depression and a lot of other issues which come up. So this is a disease we should not take lightly and feel that this is just like a common cold or flu and the young will get all right. I think they need to be very, very cautious about having good COVID appropriate behavior.
So the next question is, you have Serum Institute manufacturing a vaccine. You have Bharat Biotech manufacturing a vaccine. There are other institutes manufacturing vaccines which are in a lower level of trials. Would you suggest that the other factories make Covaxin and Covishield to ramp up the production?
Yes, this is already being done. There is already a proposal that is being pushed by the government of India also, that other vaccine manufacturers can have an agreement or an MOU with, let's say, Bharat Biotech, and they can have a tech transfer done, and they can therefore be part of the manufacturing, and they can also start manufacturing more and more doses. This is also being done because this is another strategy of increasing the number of doses that would be available in our country. So that strategy is already being looked into.
The next question is, in the AIMS protocol, you have still mentioned ivermectin, whereas FDA and others don't even mention those things. What is your opinion? Because it's cheap, it's available, and it's in the pharmacy in the next street. So how effective are these?
So I do agree with you that the data is not strong. So in the AIMS protocol, when we looked at it, we looked at safety versus what the data is there. There is no doubt that it's a very safe and, let's say, a cost-effective drug which is easily available and used a lot in this part of the world. There are some studies, and there is one study from Bangladesh, and there's another larger trial published which did show some efficacy, but there are other studies which have been shown which have not shown any efficacy. So the jury is still out, and we thought that it's something that can be offered rather than not being offered based on whatever data there is available. But I do agree that we need more robust data to say that it is useful for mild illness. For mild illness, we have many drugs which have sort of questionable utility, and that includes another drug known as favipiravir, available in our country, which is also used a lot. It is an antiviral drug used mainly for influenza. It was actually introduced in Japan as a treatment for influenza after H1N1. But some studies do show that it has a broad antiviral activity. But again, the data is not strong, but it is again DCGI approved for treatment of COVID-19 and is also used a lot. So I think we have a lot of drugs which are questionable, and the group that looked at it in our institute sort of felt more comfortable with ivermectin.
So the next question is, this virus seems to be changing its shape and all the time. We are seeing a lot of cases who are RT-PCR negative, but with classical symptoms of COVID-19, with a cough and cold, and suddenly they get into a respiratory problem. CT shows a positive, but RT-PCR is negative. And a lot of labs, some lab shows RT-PCR as negative, and the same test in another lab shows it as positive. So how do you sort of standardize these things?
So there can be multiple reasons for this. If you have the same test, it depends on the kit that is being used and the CT value that is being used as the cutoff. And if you have a very low viral load, then some kits may pick that up and show it as positive. Others may really look at this viral load and feel that this is insignificant and may not show it as positive. But I think the question here is still important, because last week I took one sort of e-hospital meeting with many hospitals in Gujarat. I took with all the doctors in hospitals in Gujarat, and because there was a huge surge of cases there, and I talked to many hospitals there. One of the things that was raised by doctors in Surat, especially, was that they are having patients who have classical CT scan which suggests COVID-19, but the RT-PCR is repeatedly coming as negative. So we brought this to the notice of ICMR and asked them to look at it, whether any variant is developing which is not being picked up by ICMR. The current data from ICMR suggests that that is not the case. It's more likely to be the way the test is conducted rather than the RT-PCR not being able to pick it up. But again, like I said, we need to be vigilant and have a very good surveillance that if there is a doubt, we must check it so that we are able to change our testing strategy or our other strategy to sort of be ahead of the virus rather than behind it.
The other question was, earlier, few months ago, we read somewhere, Dr. Gautam wants to know whether there's any connection between the severity of COVID-19 and the blood group.
So there is a paper that has been published which has looked at severity of COVID-19 and the blood group. It's difficult to explain, but it has tried to look at a large data and shown that based on the blood group, you could actually classify those who may have severe disease or less severe disease. I think we need more data before we say that that is definitely there. Definitely one thing is obvious that has been shown, that men tend to have more severe disease as compared to women. And the percentage of men who get COVID-19, severe COVID-19 is much more than women. And that is thought to be related to hormonal changes which occur in women, which may give them some degree of protection.
And what about trials in younger age group and pregnant and lactating women?
So there are two groups which were not included as far as emergency use authorization is concerned. That is children and pregnant women. Already there are trials which have been done, and some of them are almost near completion, to see two things in children. One is safety, and the other is dose that should be given to children depending on their body weight. Remember, children are not little adults, so we can't just say that we give half the dose to them. They have to be calibrated depending on what is the dose that is required in different age groups and that it is safe for them. As far as pregnant women is concerned, currently, although the emergency use authorization does not include pregnant women, various international associations, including the Federation of Obstetrics and Gynae and others, have actually said that we can consider vaccinating pregnant women because they feel that the risk-benefit analysis tends to suggest that the benefit is much more than the risk. Initially, it was felt that pregnant women don't get severe disease, but some data is now emerging that they may also get severe disease. Remember, this is also what happened in H1N1. In H1N1, initially, we were not giving a vaccine for swine flu or influenza to pregnant women. But when data emerged, they became top of the list. And currently, it is recommended that all pregnant women should get the influenza vaccine to cover for H1N1. And it gives a triple protection. It protects the mother, it protects the fetus because it protects from abortion or stillbirth. And because the antibodies cross the placenta, it gives immunity to the newborn for 6 months, and it prevents the newborn from getting influenza during the first 6 months when we cannot give a vaccine. So vaccination to pregnant women actually sometimes has a triple benefit, and that is why various associations are recommending it, but the regulators have not given it an approval. So one has to take a definite consent from the pregnant lady before giving it to her.
And the other question is, see, we see in the papers, suddenly the AstraZeneca has been stopped in Norway, in Denmark, in Copenhagen. Is this all something to do with the pharma wars, or are they facts? And what is your view on clotting occurring due to AstraZeneca? And is it applicable to our ethnic sort of group?
So I'm not sure whether I can say definitely that this is industry driven or not. There are a lot of people who feel that there may be a little bit of industry pressure, because remember, the AstraZeneca vaccine is a vaccine which could be used globally. It needs only 2 to 8 degrees centigrade for storage. And the other vaccines are more costly and require a huge cold chain investment. But having said that, there are definite reports that clotting does happen. it has been given a name, vaccine-induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia, because in a very, it's a rare side effect reported, I think, in Europe in about 3 to 4 per million individuals. And this is the effect that happens after the first dose, usually between 5 to 20 days. And the classical features are headache, pain in the legs or pain in the stomach, blurring of vision or chest pain or breathlessness. It leads to a fall in your platelets and increased chance of clotting, which can happen in the veins in the brain, in the lungs, or in the stomach, the intestine, or in the other veins. And normally it simulates another disease process which we know very well, which is known as heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. So there is a definite treatment strategy for it, which can be given to these people, and it can they can come out of this. Whatever data we have from India as far as the AEFI monitoring is concerned, it is very, very rare in our country, and it is felt that clotting in our country is not that common as it is seen in the Western population. Therefore, I think in our country, it is even rarer than what is reported in the West, and possibly we should not be that concerned. But I would just like to say that we have to have an awareness for this, because there is a definite treatment which is available, which can be given to these individuals, and if that it is suspected, it can be life-saving.
Thank you, sir. One last question. And somebody has asked whether there's an upper age limit for vaccination. And I just told them my dad is 94. Thanks to Dr. Radhakrishnan, he's had both the shots of vaccine and is doing quite fine. And the other thing, the last final question is, after vaccination, there is people want to do antibody tests. Is that useful?
So that has become a fashion, if I put it that way, that everyone wants to see his antibodies. And there are people who keep seeing their antibodies after becoming all right from COVID every 2 or 3 weeks. I have some patients who will give me a serial chart of their antibodies after they recovered from COVID and say, it's 100 now, it's come to 80, now it's becoming 70. I think we should not go down that path. You must remember 2 or 3 things. One is, what you're looking at is the IgG antibodies. What really is effective is the neutralizing antibodies, which we don't really see. And we use this as a surrogate marker. Second is that besides antibodies, we have another immune system, the cell-mediated immunity, which also gives us protection. And then we have the T cells, which are the memory cells, which remember the virus and can quickly start producing antibodies if there's an exposure. So it's important to remember that if we have taken the vaccine, be confident with the vaccine, and don't sort of go around getting your antibodies done and getting a higher blood pressure because of worry with whether your antibodies are formed or not. I don't think you should get your antibodies tested.